Okay, I am delighted to be here this evening. Thank you so much for allowing us at ICR to come out and minister to you for the last 3 weeks. Now, I have to give you a warning, though. There's a lot of information in this talk, so you need to buckle your seatbelt. But it is my prayer and hope that it will be a blessing to you, and I think it will. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. As you are probably well aware, there are very large ice sheets in the high northern and southern latitudes. Today, they cover about 10% of the Earth's land surface, but scientists are virtually unanimous that they were once larger in the past, at least once, and they covered at least maybe 30% of the Earth's land surface. In fact, secular scientists for many years believed that there were 4 ice ages just within the last 2 million years. Now, of course, you already knew that, right? You already knew that there were 4 ice ages, but in all seriousness, this is something a lot of Christians wonder about. Was there an ice age or ages? If so, how many? And how does that relate to biblical history? Well, first, let me assure you that there was an ice age. We see many geological features at lower latitudes where we do not have glaciers today, but they're indicative that there were glaciers there in the past. So there's very good reason to believe that some kind of ice age occurred. Now, let me kind of give you the secular understanding of an ice age. They believe that there have been at least 5 major ice ages throughout Earth history. They even believe that the Earth's surface was entirely frozen, basically, at one point, at least once, between 850 and 630 million years ago. And the most recent of these major ice ages is said to have occurred during the Pleistocene epoch. It supposedly began about 2.6 million years ago. And within this major ice age, you've had many what they call glacial intervals where the ice sheets advance. And this is what most people refer to in popular speech as an ice age. Now, for the last million years or so, you've supposedly had these interglacial cycles every 100,000 years, where you have a long ice age or glacial part of the cycle and a relatively short, warmer interglacial. And it's said that right now we are in one of these warmer interglacials. Now, of course, many creatures lived during the ice age that have since become extinct, like the Neanderthals, which the evolutionists for many years claim was a subhuman, primitive creature. You had the saber-toothed cat and the well-known woolly mammoth. And many large animals became extinct at the end of the Ice Age, including the woolly mammoth. And why this happened is one of the great mysteries of Earth science. So that, in a nutshell, is how secular scientists understand ice ages. They believe there have been many of them, and they believe that they have repeated, and that you've had about 50 of those within the last 2.5 million years. Now, you probably noticed in that discussion there was much talk of millions of years. But if you read your Bible, there's really no hint of millions of years anywhere in there. It's very clear from a straightforward reading of Scripture that both the earth and universe are just a few thousand years old. And so that raises a very natural question in people's minds. Is the Bible simply wrong about Earth history? Well, I want to come back to that question later, but let me point out to you where the secular scientists are coming from. They hold to a particular philosophy called uniformitarianism that says the present is the key to the past. So they believe that they can account for Earth history using only processes that are going on today, basically, for the most part. So, for instance, they claim that you don't need a miracle to explain the existence of our solar system. They claim that it formed from a rotating cloud of dust and gas billions of years ago. Likewise, they claim that because erosion is occurring very slowly today, they believe it's, for the most part, always been slow and gradual. And they would argue that you can explain the formation of the Grand Canyon by the Colorado River, that this happened very slowly over millions of years. Now, the Apostle Peter warned us in his second epistle that there would come in the last days scoffers holding to a uniformitarian philosophy. And this is what the Apostle Peter said. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lust and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. That is a very good description of a uniformitarian philosophy. Now, with that background information in mind, there are 3 points that I hope you will take home with you about an ice age. There are 3 reasons that you can be confident as a Christian about how an ice age relates to biblical history. And one of these is that the secular explanations for an ice age simply don't work. The second reason, however, is that the Bible provides a convincing explanation for an ice age. And finally, 3, despite the talk you hear about multiple ice ages over millions of years, there was really just one ice age. So let's look at these points in a little more detail. First, the secular story doesn't work. Now, this may surprise you. Actually, I have a cute little acrostic for you, ICE, to help you remember these key points. Since this is an ice age talk, this seemed appropriate. And the I stands for an inadequate mechanism. They have a hard time explaining an ice age. And that may surprise you because you hear them talk about so many ice ages over many millions of years. But this is considered to be one of the great mysteries of science. They have come up with literally dozens of theories to explain an ice age. In fact, someone came up with a new one just last week or a couple of weeks ago. Now, right now, the popular one is something called the astronomical or Milankovitch theory. And it's the idea that you have these subtle changes in sunlight at these high northern latitudes during the summer months. So if you look at this chart on the screen, you see all these red wiggles. And when the wiggles go up, that means you're getting more sunlight. And when the wiggles go down, you're getting less sunlight. And the reason they care about the northern high latitudes is that's because that's where you've had these large ice sheets. And they care about summer because that's the critical season for an ice age. If you want to have an ice age, the snow and ice cannot melt for many consecutive summers because you want the snow and ice to build up to form these ice sheets. So they think that these subtle changes can cause an ice age. Well, what is it that causes the changes in sunlight? Well, the Earth is going through these orbital motions, and there's some very subtle changes in those motions, very slow changes. And if you believe that the Earth has been in existence for billions of years, then you can run those equations backwards, essentially, and you can figure out what the tilt of the Earth's axis would have been hundreds of thousands of years ago, or even millions of years ago, and likewise the shape and the orientation of the Earth's orbit, and so on and so forth. So these subtle orbital changes are thought to result in these changes in sunlight. And so very simply, this is the idea in a nutshell. If you have less summer sunlight, the ice sheets grow, they get larger, and you have an ice age. When you have more summer sunlight, the ice sheets retreat, and you get one of these warmer interglacials. There's a lot of problems with this theory. First, these cycles are very weak. It's a very weak mechanism. These are subtle changes in sunlight, and so really, by itself, it's not a sufficient explanation for an ice age. So you need some other mechanism or mechanisms to amplify those subtle changes if you're actually going to get an ice age. And that, by the way, is the reason that secular scientists are so much more worried about global warming than our creation scientists, because they believe the astronomical theory is correct, but they also recognize that by itself it is an insufficient mechanism. So they believe that there are other factors like the amount of sea ice or the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that can amplify these subtle changes and bring about an ice age. Of course, if you look at that poster, it looks more like global cooling instead of global warming. But if you're not sure, I guess you can just call it climate change, and that covers all the bases, which is what they're doing now. Okay, so you've got those problems, and also there are these mysteries and paradoxes in this theory that even the secular scientists acknowledge. If you'll read a textbook about ancient climates, what they call paleoclimatology, you see that you've got these problems that even they acknowledge. So the I stands for an inadequate mechanism, and the C stands for circular reasoning. Now, as you're probably aware, there are very thick ice sheets over Antarctica and Greenland, and scientists have drilled holes into that ice, and they've extracted these cylindrical cores that can have total lengths of thousands of meters. And they claim that they have identified hundreds of thousands of yearly or annual layers in those ice cores. And of course, that doesn't fit very well with the Bible's short time scale. Not only that, they've done the same with the seafloor sediments. They've extracted cores from the seafloor sediments, and they claim that these have been deposited over many millions of years. And perhaps most perplexing for the Bible-believing Christian, they claim that there are chemical clues within the ice and chemical clues within the seafloor sediments that are telling a story about how climate has changed over hundreds of thousands and millions of years. And supposedly this story agrees very well with the astronomical theory, which assumes that the earth has been in existence for eons. Now, parents and grandparents, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say. I understand that ice cores and seafloor sediments are not as exciting as dinosaurs. But let me tell you why you ought to care about this. Because your children and grandchildren may very well have teachers or professors who will tell them that the ice cores and seafloor sediments present an unanswerable argument that the earth is older than the Bible will allow, and they will use that as a sledgehammer to attack their faith in the scriptures. That's why you need to care about this issue. Now, with that in mind, let's look at this in a little more detail. What about this claim that you've got hundreds of thousands of annual layers in the ice cores? Well, this may seem like an obvious point, but people tend to forget it. You can try to count these annual layers, but first you have to correctly identify them. And that's not trivial. You do see distinct layering at the tops of the cores, but those layers blur and get thinner with increasing depth. And so in order to date the core, you have to know how much thinning has occurred. And in order to do that, you need a mathematical ice flow model. And these models make some assumptions, two of which are particularly relevant for this discussion. They assume from the beginning that the ice sheets have been in existence for millions of years, and they assume that they have maintained more or less the same heights for all that time. Now, if you take those two assumptions and you turn the crank, you will get hundreds of thousands of years. It's just built in. This paper was written by a glaciologist who has co-authored a textbook on the physics of glaciers that's been in use for more than 40 years. And in this paper, he acknowledged that ice sheet modeling is the most frequent method for dating the ice cores. Likewise, here's a more recent paper where they acknowledge that they used ice flow models to construct, not measure, construct the age scales at these drilling sites in East Antarctica. Now, I can guess what the secular scientists will say. They will say, look, we admit that our flow models assume millions of years, but look at the great agreement between the astronomical theory, the seafloor sediments, and the ice cores. That shows that those old Earth assumptions are justified. Well, is that really the case? You have to understand that the secular scientists have become so convinced that the astronomical theory is correct that they actually use it to date the seafloor sediments, and this technique is called orbital tuning. So how does this work? Well, they go to the seafloor sediments and these cores that they've extracted, and there are these tiny creatures called foraminifera in the ocean that make these little shells, and when they die, those shells drift to the ocean bottom, and they become part of the sediments accumulating on the ocean floor. Now, these shells are made out of calcium carbonate, which contains oxygen. Now, there's two fairly common varieties or isotopes of the oxygen atom. One of them is called oxygen-18 and the other is called oxygen-16. And oxygen-18 is just a little bit heavier than oxygen-16, but oxygen-16 is a lot more abundant than oxygen-18. So they can take one of these 4M shells and they can measure the amount of oxygen-18, they can measure the amount of oxygen-16, and they can calculate a number called the oxygen isotope ratio, which is indicated by that little symbol there. That's just the shorthand notation for this number. And it just tells you how much oxygen-18 there is compared to oxygen-16, and they compare it to a standard value of this oxygen isotope ratio. Now they also, let me point out, they also sometimes use this symbol to indicate that ratio. Now, the secular scientists believe that this is a climate indicator. So when you go into a seafloor sediment core and you see higher values of this number, that is thought to indicate ice ages. So what they do is they take the core, they make these measurements, and then you can plot those values on a graph. And when you do, you see all these wiggles that go up and down. Now, the secular scientists have convinced themselves that these wiggles are dominated by these cycles of like 100,000 years and 41,000 years. And those are dominant cycles within the astronomical theory. So they believe that when they see these cycles, they are seeing something caused by the astronomical theory. And they use that to date the seafloor sediments. Now, we don't have time to get into this right now, but there are some very good arguments that the bulk of those seafloor sediments had to have been deposited rapidly. And when you get home, you might want to do a search for a little article entitled Manganese Nodules and the Age of the Ocean Floor. I'm sure you can find it on the internet very quickly, and it's a very illuminating, interesting discussion about an argument that for the seafloor sediments being deposited rapidly, not over millions of years. So the bottom line is they're using the astronomical theory to date the seafloor sediments. Now you may think, well, that sounds dangerous. I mean, what if the astronomical theory is wrong? Couldn't you end up really deceiving yourself? Yes, you could. And the secular scientists recognize that, and they would argue, however, that they have these independent checks or constraints that they use to keep them honest, to make sure they don't deceive themselves. And they use this as a guide when they're using the orbital tuning process. Now, one of these checks is what they call fossil events. Now, what on earth is a fossil event? Well, you have to remember how they interpret the sediments. They believe that these sediments were slowly deposited over millions of years, and within those sediments, you have these fossil remains of different creatures. And so when they look at a layer of sediment, they believe they are seeing a snapshot of the history of life on Earth at some time in the prehistoric past. Now, there are some fossils that so far have only been found in narrow ranges of sediment, and they call these index fossils. And they believe they only lived within certain windows of prehistoric time. And so let's just make them an example. Let's say you have a particular foram that has been found in sediments that they date as being between 60 and 62 million years old. Well, if they find another layer of sediment containing that same foram, they will tend to assume that it is also 60 to 62 million years old. So they are assuming that evolution is true, and they're using that to guide the dating of the sediments. So right off the bat, they are already assuming millions of years, and they are assuming that evolution is true. Now, one of the other checks they use are what are called paleomagnetic reversals. Now, what on earth is a paleomagnetic reversal? Well, you're probably aware that you have these mid-ocean ridges out on the ocean floor where hot material is coming up from the Earth's interior and is forming new seafloor. New seafloor is being formed, and it's spreading away from those ridges. And when that lava cools, it records information about the direction of the Earth's magnetic field. And the secular scientists believe that these are chronological anchor points, that if they can nail down the dates for those magnetic reversals, it will assist them in dating the seafloor sediments. So they use the paleomagnetic reversals to help them in this process. But then you may wonder, well, okay, but how do you date the magnetic reversal? Sure, you've got these volcanic rocks that have information about the direction of the Earth's magnetic field, but that doesn't tell you anything about when the reversal actually occurred. Well, they use radioisotope dating to do that. So they're using the magnetic reversals to help them date the seafloor sediments, and then they're using radioisotope dating methods to date the reversals. Now, this is where it really starts to get interesting, because there are cases where they have either rejected or adjusted radioisotope dates because they did not agree with the astronomical theory. Now, here's a quote from a text I have where the author describes how there was a disagreement between the radioisotope dating methods and the astronomical theory. The astronomical theory was giving slightly older ages for these magnetic reversals compared to something called the potassium-argon dating method. And so they concluded, based on this orbital tuning, that the potassium-argon dates were a little bit off. But they said, okay, so they said these potassium-argon dates were wrong, but they said, that's okay, that's justified. We can justify this because there's another dating method called argon-argon dating that agrees with the astronomical theory. So they concluded on this basis that this newer dating method called argon-argon dating was more accurate. So they actually use the astronomical theory as a filter to decide whether a radioisotope date is good or bad. Okay, now I'm hoping you're starting to see a little bit of a problem here with this chart. Now I want to say a little bit more about argon dating. We're not going to get into any technical details, but you need to understand they see this as one of the latest and greatest dating methods. And they also, it's a little bit different because in order to use this method, if you're going to use it to date a rock of unknown age, you also have to have a rock whose age is known. You need a dating standard, okay? So you have the rock you're trying to date, but then you also have a rock whose age is known. Well, how do you get the age of the standard? Well, one way is they use the potassium-argon method, okay? So in a sense, they're calibrating one radioisotope dating method with another one, or you could say that the argon-argon dating method is just an extension of the potassium-argon dating method. In fact, it's not that uncommon for them to use one radioisotope dating method to calibrate another one. Now that may surprise those of you who have been taught that these are absolute dating methods, that you just make some measurements, plug them into a formula, and it gives you the age of the rock. Not quite, not quite. They will often use one radioisotope dating method to calibrate another one. But there is a second method that they use to get the date of the standard. Would anybody like to take a wild guess at what it is? No, not carbon dating. They use the astronomical theory. They use the astronomical theory to get the age of their standard. And they call this intercalibration, and they do it all the time. So let's kind of back up here. It was the agreement with the astronomical theory that supposedly proved that this newer dating method was better than potassium-argon dating, but then they turn around and then they use the astronomical theory to calibrate their argon-argon dating standards. I don't know about you, that seems a little circular to me, and I think it is. You can see this chart starting to get a little more and more complicated as we go along. Not only, however, do they use the astronomical theory to decide whether dates are good or not, they do the same thing with evolution. There have been cases in the past where radioisotope dates have been rejected because they contradict the evolutionary story. And years ago, Marvin Lubino wrote this fantastic book called Bones of Contention that's really a critique of these claims of alleged ape men that the evolutionists keep trotting out. He had a fascinating critique of how an example where you had 4 different dating methods that seemed to agree with one another, but the evolutionists threw them out because had they accepted those dates as legitimate, it would have contradicted the evolutionary story. And so the bottom line was these dating methods were trumped by a pig fossil. And if you do a search for "the pigs took it all," you can still find this article on the internet and read it. It's in the first version or edition of his book, but unfortunately it's not in the second edition. This article is still online. Okay, so not only do they use the astronomical theory to filter out bad radioisotope dates, they do the same thing with evolution. So basically, the way you tell whether a date is good or not is whether it agrees with evolution. The good dates agree with evolution, and the bad dates don't agree with evolution. That's how the game is played. Okay, now that's basically how they date the seafloor sediments, but this is an Ice Age talk, so let's talk about how they date the ice cores. Well, this paper here is one of many we could look at, and the authors describe how they basically got an age scale for this Vostok, that's a Russian name, it's an ice core in Antarctica, and they did it by linking it to a seafloor sediment core in the Southern Ocean. So they used the seafloor sediments to tune the ice flow models, and then the ice flow models in turn assign ages to the ice cores. But they had a second method that they used. They used orbital tuning to get the age scale for the Vostok ice core. Now normally, they use orbital tuning to get ages for the sediments, and then they use the sediments to date the ice cores. But in this case, they said, well, we're just gonna cut out the middleman. There's chemical isotope data in the ice core, we're just gonna tune it directly. So that's one way they do this. So this is all going on, and I just have to show you this last example. There was a paper published in 2003 where they were dating a core, a sediment core, off the coast of New Zealand. And they archived a summary of the methods they used on the NOAA.gov website. If you want to check it out sometime, you can go to this address and look it up. But if you look at the way they dated the middle portion of the core, they did it by taking the oxygen isotope values in this core and tuning them to the oxygen isotope values in MD 95-2042. Well, what's that? That's another sediment core, but this one was located off the coast of Portugal, okay? So it's not uncommon for them to use one seafloor sediment core to date another one. But it gets worse, because then you wonder, well, how did they get the age scale for this Portuguese sediment core? Well, that's okay. They got that from an ice core in central Greenland. And then when they dated the bottom of the core, they got that from the Vostok ice core in Antarctica. So not only do they use the seafloor sediments to date the ice cores, they turn around and they come full circle and they use the ice cores to date the seafloor sediments. And of course, the evolutionists love to remind us that the dates agree with one another. Well, yeah, I mean, what do you expect? Okay? You see, this is the popular perception that people have. They think you have these independent dating methods and they agree with one another because the Earth really is fantastically old. No, the reason they generally get agreement between the methods is because it is a gigantic exercise in circular reasoning. And I hope you will notice that there is an unspoken assumption throughout this entire process, this assumption of uniformitarianism that the Apostle Peter warned us about. Uniformitarianism says God didn't create the solar system 6,000 years ago. No, it's been in existence for billions of years. Uniformitarianism says God did not create life on Earth. No, it evolved. And uniformitarianism says that because seafloor sediments are slowly being deposited on the ocean floor today, they have always been deposited slowly and gradually on the ocean floor. Marvin Lubino hit the nail on the head. He said, in the dating game, evolution always wins, because you can normally find, if a date disagrees with the evolutionary story, you can almost always find an excuse to change it or get rid of it. However, Marvin was a little bit wrong on this. It's really in the dating game, evolution almost always wins. Because even with all this circular reasoning, there are still cases where things don't line up, and there are things about the evolutionary story that don't make sense. And you might want to look up the termination 2 causality problem when you get home. That's a particularly embarrassing problem that they haven't quite been able to figure out. So the I stands for an inadequate mechanism, the C stands for circular reasoning, and the E stands for elastic old Earth stories. You see, they keep changing their stories. For 60 years, they said there were 4 Pleistocene ice ages. Around 1982, they said there were 30, and now they're claiming that there were more than 50. And supposedly, at one time, all of these stories have been confirmed by the data. You see, it doesn't matter what story the evolutionist is telling you, he's going to insist that it's absolute truth, and you had better believe it, buddy. Evolutionists are always wrong, but they're never in doubt. Okay, so that's the first point. Secular explanations don't work, and I hope that little acrostic ice will help you remember those key points. Now, if we do know that there was an ice age, however, we still have to explain it. So how do you get an ice age? Well, if I had to give you a 1-sentence requirement, you want the snow and ice not to melt for many consecutive summers. Okay, and in order to do that, you need 2 things. You need cooler summers, which is obvious, right? You want the snow and ice not to melt, but you also need heavier snowfall, because if the snowfall is light, it may still melt even if you do have the cooler summers. Now, Michael Ord is a respected creation scientist. For many years, he was a professional meteorologist, and he has come up with a very convincing explanation for the Ice Age. And it's kind of paradoxical, but it requires heat. So I've got another cute little acrostic here to help you remember these points. The H stands for hot oceans. Now, why are hot oceans important? If you can somehow significantly warm the temperatures of the oceans, you're going to get much more evaporation. And more evaporation is going to put a lot more moisture into the atmosphere, which will ultimately result in more precipitation, including snowfall at high and mid latitudes and high elevations. Now, Dr. Larry Vardim is an atmospheric scientist who recently retired from ICR, and Dr. Wes Brewer is a creation scientist with a strong computing background. And they wanted to see, well, what would happen if you could somehow crank up the temperatures of the oceans? And they were particularly interested in Yosemite National Park because we know that there were thick ice sheets over Yosemite National Park. So what they did was they took a standard meteorological computer program. First, they calibrated it against known meteorological conditions to make sure that it gave sensible results. And then they said, well, we're just going to crank up the temperature and see what happens. And they published their results in a creation journal. And the pictures I'm about to show you are from this article. And they've done other case studies as well. And I don't want to bore you with too much detail, but you're looking at the California coastline. And in the middle of the picture, you've got Yosemite National Park. And the general trend is, as you increase sea surface temperature, you're getting more and more precipitation. Okay? Now, we're not necessarily saying that you need temperatures that high, but the general point is that you get dramatically more precipitation if you warm the oceans. Now, the A stands for aerosols, and these are tiny particles or droplets. And these are important because we know that you can get cooler summers from aerosols that come from volcanic eruptions. You see, when you have a volcanic eruption, you have these aerosols that end up in the stratosphere, and they reflect sunlight, giving you a cooling effect. And we know, this is not hypothetical, we know this happens from observed recent volcanic eruptions, and we also know from observation that the cooling effect is greatest during the summer and autumn months. And there have been many, many large volcanic eruptions in the past that have dwarfed even eruptions, scary eruptions like Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens was actually a pretty puny eruption compared to eruptions that have occurred in the past. So here is Mike Ord's explanation for an ice age in a nutshell. If you can somehow significantly warm the oceans 10 or 20 degrees Celsius, that's going to give you much more evaporation. That puts more moisture into the atmosphere. That leads to increased snowfall. And if you have significant volcanic activity, that's going to put aerosols into the atmosphere. Those aerosols will reflect sunlight, and you're going to get the cooler summers you need to keep the snow and ice from melting. And they will build up, forming these ice sheets, and you will have an ice age. So that's it in a nutshell, which may raise a question. That sounds like a fairly straightforward mechanism. So you may wonder, if there was an ice age, and we know of conditions that could cause an ice age, then why is an ice age a mystery to secular scientists? It's because the conditions are not uniform. I said if you can somehow warm up the oceans, that would work. Well, that would take an outrageous amount of energy. How on earth are you supposed to warm the oceans 10 or 20 degrees Celsius? And the volcanic cooling, that sounds good. The problem is the cooling effect only lasts for a few years. So if you're going to use this as a mechanism for an ice age, it's not enough to have one batch of volcanic eruptions. You have to have repeated eruptions over many years in order to get this to work. And that brings us to the final requirement for an ice age, and it is a truncated short time scale. When you truncate something, you chop it off and shorten it. And a short time scale is the key to getting this work. You see, both creation and secular scientists agreed that there was an enormous amount of volcanic activity in the past. Why then can the secular scientists not use this to explain an ice age? It's because they insist that those volcanic eruptions were separated by thousands and even millions of years, and if you do that, that dilutes the cooling effect. Those eruptions have to occur close together in time. So a short time scale is the key to getting this to work. And that brings us to the question of ice sheets. We've already seen that the secular scientists engage in a great deal of circular reasoning when they date the ice sheets. But can you get thick ice sheets like we see in Antarctica and Greenland to form rapidly? You certainly can. Crater Glacier, in a small way, gives us an example of this. This glacier has only been forming for a little more than 30 years, but it's already got an average thickness of over 300 feet. So you can get thick ice sheets to form rapidly in a short time scale. So does the Bible give us a clue to some mechanism that would help explain an ice age? It certainly does. It certainly does. The Bible describes a flood that God sent on the world in the days of Noah as punishment for the world's sins. And the Bible says that on the day that flood began, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up. And that implies a lot of geological activity. We believe there was a lot of volcanic activity occurring in the flood, including seafloor spreading. We think that pretty much the entire pre-flood ocean floor was subducted down into the mantle during the flood. And so we got a brand new seafloor, and of course you can imagine the amount of heat given off by that amount of lava. And I want to just digress here a little bit and kind of give you a feel for just how cataclysmic the flood was. You've probably seen pictures like this, but I don't know if you've ever made the mental connection between it and the flood. You see, when you see those mid-ocean ridges, those are scars from the flood. We do believe in plate tectonics, but we think it occurred very rapidly and dramatically during the flood. In fact, one of the world's leading experts in this field, John Baumgartner, is a Bible-believing Christian, and he has done an enormous amount of work in this area, and we think that catastrophic rapid plate tectonics played a major role in the Genesis flood. So you have volcanic activity, you've got seafloor spreading, you have possibly meteoritic activity occurring during the flood, and also the Bible talks about the waters from the fountains of the great deep. And if those waters came from within the earth's interior, they would have probably been warm, maybe even hot. And these things together would give you the warmer oceans you need to provide the abundant snowfall for an ice age after the flood. Now, we see that the flood can provide the warmer oceans, but can it also provide many years of volcanic activity? It certainly can. That volcanic activity is not going to come to a screeching halt after the flood. Because the earth is reeling from this cataclysm, there is going to be sporadic volcanic activity afterward, but it's going to gradually decrease in intensity. And so we think the volcanic activity we see today is a faint echo of that volcanic activity that occurred during and shortly after the flood. And as a result of that volcanic activity, there's going to be more eruptions, putting more aerosols into the atmosphere, and that's going to give you the needed summer cooling for many years. You see, the Genesis flood is the key to understanding Earth history. And we have a book that was authored by our president, Dr. John Morris, that explains biblically and scientifically why the flood had to be a global event, not a local flood, as some Christians say. Now, if you're thinking ahead here, you may be thinking, okay, you're saying that this model requires an enormous amount of volcanic activity during the Ice Age. Is it possible that there might be some hint of that within those deep ice cores? Yes, there is, but you have to take off the evolutionary glasses and put on the flood glasses to see it, because it's a worldview issue. This paper was written not that long ago, where the authors describe how they counted 850 volcanic signals in this ice core from Greenland, the GISP2 ice core. And these aren't just any old eruptions, these are large eruptions, and 700 of them are from the time that they would date as being 9,000 to 110,000 years ago. Now, we think those dates are inflated, but we do believe that's the Ice Age portion of the core. So even the secular scientists acknowledge that you have hundreds of volcanic eruptions occurring during the Ice Age. Now, if you have hundreds of volcanic eruptions occurring over 100,000 years, that's no big deal. But if you have hundreds of volcanic eruptions occurring within a few hundred years, then that is a potent cooling mechanism for a flood. And I want to make it clear that I don't necessarily accept the number 700 at face value. Sometimes these volcanic signatures don't show up on the ice, and it's possible their old Earth assumptions may be skewing the numbers a little bit. But the point is, even the secular scientists acknowledge that you've got evidence of hundreds of volcanic eruptions during the Ice Age. So they have trouble explaining an Ice Age because they reject biblical history. You see, they have an inadequate mechanism in the astronomical theory. They engage in some outrageous circular reasoning when they date the ice cores. And they have these elastic old Earth stories that keep changing. But the Bible gives us a very convincing explanation for an Ice Age. You would have hot oceans resulting from the flood. That's going to lead to increased evaporation. And aerosols resulting from these volcanic eruptions will give you the necessary summer cooling to keep the snow and ice from melting, but it's the Bible's truncated, short time scale that makes it all work. So the secular explanations don't work, and the Bible provides a convincing explanation. And that brings us to our last point. There was only one ice age. We think it probably lasted about 700 years total. That's a rough number, that's our best guess. And we think this would have been approximately the time that people like Job and Abraham lived. And it's striking that you have more references to snow, ice, and cold in the book of Job than in any other book of the Bible. Now, we can't make too much of that because Job lived in the Middle East. He probably didn't see those high latitude ice sheets, but he might have heard stories about them. And this may also be a hint that the climate back then was different than it is now. That you would be getting considerably more snow and precipitation in the Middle East than you do today. For instance, even the Sahara Desert once received abundant rainfall. So we know, the Bible talks about a well-watered land. It talks about land flowing with milk and honey, and that seems to suggest that conditions were different back then. But now, if we're saying there was one ice age, then what about the claim of many ice ages? Remember, the evolutionists claim there were many ice ages, so how do we address that claim? Well, first of all, we have to break this up into two parts. Remember, they are claiming that there were 50 ice ages within the last 2.5 million years, and they're also claiming that there are these really big ice ages many, many, many millions of years ago. And so there are two different answers to each of these 2 points. What about these Pleistocene ice ages? You need to understand that the main reason the secular scientists claim there were 50 ice ages during the Pleistocene is because of the astronomical theory. That's the main reason. The astronomical theory, the way they interpret the seafloor sediments, they've convinced themselves that there are 50 ice ages. But in reality, there's not much geological evidence for that. There's a little bit that you find at the edges of the ice sheets, but you can explain that by advances and retreats of a single ice age rather than multiple ice ages over millions of years. You see, remember that you've got this sporadic volcanic activity after the flood, and so there's going to be times when there's going to be lulls in that volcanic activity. And so what's going to happen, things are going to warm up a little bit, and the ice sheets will retreat. And then you'll have another volcanic eruption. It'll put more aerosols into the atmosphere. Things will cool off and the ice sheets will advance. So you can have these retreats, these surges and retreats of the ice sheet multiple times during a single ice age, and we think they're simply misinterpreting the geological data. But now what about what about snowball Earth? What about this idea of many ancient ice ages millions of years ago? Remember that we are claiming that the fossils and the sediments, the vast majority of them, were deposited during the flood, okay? And we have a book that deals with that, The Fossil Record, written by our president, Dr. John Morris and Mr. Frank Sherwin. And, the flood explains fossils because floods form fossils fast, okay? So if you want to read more about this, this is another resource for you. But here's the point. We are arguing that these were deposited during the flood. And really, that may be too conservative. That bracket maybe should go down a little bit and probably up some a little bit as well. But you have these ice age geological features at the top. Well, now that makes sense, right? The ice age comes after the flood, so you would expect that to be above them. But then what about this evidence for other ice ages? The skeptic points out quite correctly that you cannot have ice ages during a global flood. And he's right, you can't. Well, the key to answering him is to realize that there are other things that can mimic these indications of the presence of glaciers. You see, one of these indications are these striation or scratches under the underlying rock. When you have a glacier moving along, you have little rocks that are embedded in the ice, and as the glacier advances, it cuts scratches in the rocks. Well, there are other things that can do that as well, like mass flows, avalanches, things of that nature. They too can cut scratches in the rocks, and as a result of all this debris, you can get what looks like glacial debris. But it's not caused by glaciers, it's caused by these mass flows, these avalanches. And even the secular scientists acknowledge that many of these, if not all of them, were actually occurred underwater. So these are giant underwater landslides that they are misinterpreting as evidence of glaciers. Now, giant underwater landslides during a flood, well, that makes sense. That really makes sense. So here is a classic example of how you can have an argument that seems like an argument against Scripture, but when you dig a little bit deeper and you look at the evidence a little more carefully, not only do the data not contradict Scripture, they confirm what the Bible is saying. So those are the 3 points, folks. The secular explanations for an ice age don't work, but the Bible provides a convincing explanation, and then there was just one ice age. And I want to kind of wrap this up by asking you a question that Mike Ord often asks people, and it's a good question. And he points out that the evolutionists cannot explain the Ice Age, which is the most recent major geological event in Earth history. Now, if that's true, why then should you believe them when they tell you these stories about things that supposedly happened billions of years ago? You see, the Bible has the key to making sense of Earth history. So I hope this little talk has been a blessing to you. And we've got some resources for you. I hope that I made this information understandable for you, but you're probably going to have trouble remembering some of it. So we've got resources to help you out. We have a free monthly magazine called Acts and Facts. You can go to our website, icr.org, and there's a button at the top of the page. You can click on it, and you can sign up for it at home. And again, this is a completely free resource. Every month we have articles dealing with the creation-evolution controversy. We have also done a book, a little booklet on the Ice Age. We want every family to have one of these because we want you to know the answers to these claims that the skeptics make. When they bring up the ice cores, when they bring up the seafloor sediments, when they talk about many ice ages over millions of years, we want you to know the answers. And we've got a lot of other resources as well. We've got our Creation Basics book, our Creation Basics and Beyond book. These are fantastic resources. They are a great introduction to this topic. And the one on the right, I'm particularly proud of it because we deal with a lot of the newer evolutionary arguments that are not covered in some of the older apologetics resources. We've also got some books dealing with miscellaneous topics. We got one on dinosaurs. Mr. Frank Sherwin has done a new book on animals, and it also has a section about dinosaurs. So if you want to learn more about dinosaurs, that's a great resource. And we also have a book called Footprints in the Ash that deals with Mount St. Helens. And Mount St. Helens is very exciting for biblical creation because it proved that you can get rocks forming very rapidly. You do not need millions of years. And then, of course, we've got our video series, Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis. So I hope you will avail yourselves of these resources. And we also have a website, icr.org. Feel free to go there anytime. And we even have a section of the website that is devoted solely to the subject of the Ice Age. And we have articles there dealing with these topics. And I hope you will avail yourselves of them and that they will be a blessing to you. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay.
Dr. Hebert, thanks so much. They're going to bring some stools out here, and we're going to have a seat here in just a second.
Okay.
You're a very smart man.
Well,
very smart.
Okay.
And you mentioned at one point that you weren't going to get into technical data. I just want you to know my definition of technical data is way different than yours.
Okay.
But fantastic.
Okay.
I think you did a great job of illustrating the problems and then showing the technicalities behind it. It's not just, oh, I think it's this. You were demonstrating that.
Right.
Oh, here we go.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to grab a little swig.
You bet.
All right. Okay.
So, how does one get interested in your line of work?
Well, I've been interested in creation science since I was probably in the 7th grade. And I have to say that a book by our founder, Dr. Henry Morris, really had a huge impact on my life. Because about that age, I started to wonder, well, how can I be sure that what I've been taught is really true? What if it's all just made up? And so a friend of our family's loaned me a book that he had written called Scientific Creationism. And I was just blown away. It was fantastic, and it made a huge impact. And from that moment on, I was just interested in this topic. And I've also just been interested in climates before and after the flood. That's just kind of an interest of mine, especially before the flood. I haven't really had a chance to work on that too much lately. But I think one of the reasons that I've been ending up doing this, well, one reason is Chaz Morse, one of our staff members who kind of runs our events department. He told me, Jake, you're going to do an Ice Age talk. Okay, so all right. So I did that, but I'm glad he had me do that, because I think the Ice Age is one area where we see how the creation model really shines. And I can't, there's no way that I can really show you the detail of the work that has been done on this in just 50 minutes. It's the details of the work that are truly impressive and that Mike Ord has done. And I think this is a way for us to show people, showcase the work that's been done. I think in a way, it's a strategic topic, and I'm glad we're able to talk about it.
That is fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, I spend a lot of time in the Bible, a lot of time in the Word studying it. And I had never seen before what you pointed out in 1 Peter 3.
Right.
That they're going to say that it's always continued. I've never seen that before.
Yes.
You showed me something that I had never paid attention to. That is just absolutely fascinating that 2,000 years ago, the Lord was speaking to Peter and he was predicting, this is what's going to happen. At one point, they're going to say that there is no change whatsoever.
Right.
And the patterns continue on. And then he goes on later in that passage to explain how that's not accurate. So,
well, it's interesting. If you look at that passage, those scoffers deny three things. They deny creation, they deny the flood, and they deny that the Lord Jesus is coming again. And if you think about it, that's basically what evolutionists say. So I think that prophecy is being fulfilled in our times.
That is wonderful. Well, we've had a number of people that have sent in questions, both here in the participating audience and those online. So let's deal with a few of those. Apologetically speaking, how can the Ice Age easily be addressed? Those who use this as an atheistic pressure point.
Okay, I'm assuming the person asking the question is, how do we respond to that? Well, I think this is one way to do it. You show them that they can't explain an Ice Age, and I dare say that most of the people who are using that as a pressure point don't really know that much about it. I don't think many people are aware of just how many problems there are with secular explanations for an Ice Age. There are lots of things about the secular explanation for an Ice Age that just don't make sense. And I think getting informed, that's one thing we can do, and sharing this information with people. Really, I'll tell you what I think would be good is I think we need to spend more time on this. I think if someone's really interested in knowing and wants to give this view a fair hearing, I don't think 1 hour is enough. I think you probably need like 5 or 6 hours to just start showing people just how much work has gone into this.
Yeah, I think you've demonstrated tonight how much detail there is involved in this. It's not just a superficial examination. It is a deep, thorough, exhaustive examination.
Right.
Yeah. So please explain mammoths with food still in their stomachs.
Oh, okay. That one comes up a lot. Okay, well, first of all, we said earlier that the extinction of the woolly mammoth is one of the great mysteries of the earth science. So I might as well just tell you what we think happened to the woolly mammoths. You have to understand that there's many mysteries associated with that. The first mystery is, how do you have millions of mammoths living in Siberia to begin with? One of the problems for the secular explanation is that even today, temperatures in Siberia during the winter can be 40 degrees below zero. And to make matters worse, the evolutionists believe that it was 10 to 20 degrees colder during the Ice Age. So remember, this is supposed to be a warm interglacial. So if the mammoths could not live in Siberia today, then how on earth are they supposed to have lived in Siberia during an Ice Age? That's the first problem. And this model explains that, because remember, after the flood, you have much warmer oceans, And so we think for a long time after the flood, there was no sea ice over the Arctic Sea. And as a result of that warmer water, you get this warming of the atmosphere near Siberia, and that warm flow of air onshore is going to give you a much more temperate climate. Now, what we think happened is, as the Ice Age progressed, first of all, one of the things that occurs in the Ice Age is you have cooler summers. Okay, so you're not going to have that's going to tend to suppress thunderstorms. You're not going to have as much moisture, and things are going to start to dry out. Now, at the end of the Ice Age, you're going to have catastrophic melting of this ice, and you're going to have all this fresh water flow out over the Arctic Sea, and it's going to freeze, okay? Now, what that does, though, is that locks up a lot of moisture, so it's going to dry out even more, because now you have all this sea ice that's preventing evaporation from occurring. And without getting into too many details, you're going to have a big temperature difference between the Arctic area and the lower latitudes. And that's going to set up these strong winds. And we think as a result of these strong winds, you're going to have all this dust that's blowing, and you're going to have severe dust storms that are comparable, if not worse, to the kind of dust storms you saw during the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. And we think a lot of these mammoths were literally buried alive in these dust storms. Now, about the food, okay, a lot of people used to say, well, that means you had to have a snap. You had to have a cold snap where the temperature has to drop to minus 150 degrees Fahrenheit, which is just physically implausible. Turns out it's not a problem, because we now know, based on elephants, that they don't digest most of their food in the stomach. The stomach is like a storage area. And so they digest most of their food in the hindgut. And so that's why that food isn't really decayed that much. In fact, we know that you don't need a cold snap for that, because they have actually found the same thing with mastodon. There was a mastodon found, I believe, in North America that was not frozen, but it also had food in its stomach that had not totally decayed. And the same thing is true. We've observed this with elephants as well. So you don't need any fantastic explanation to explain that. It's a byproduct of the elephant digestive system.
I have no follow-up question to that.
Okay, all right, okay.
Can I just lean against you and maybe get smarter?
Okay,
That is amazing.
Okay.
So are there other plausible theories, such as I don't know how to pronounce this word, the Hovine theory, that could also be another mechanism for an ice age, including the flood?
I don't think so.
So can you explain what the Hovine theory is?
I'm not really that familiar with it. Eric Hovind, he's a friend of our ministry, and his dad has also done a lot of creation ministry as well. But I'm not familiar with it. I'm just not too familiar with it. But I can tell you, looking at what Mike Ord has done, I would be very surprised if somebody comes up with something better than what he's done. Yeah.
Okay, good. So with several extreme winters followed by moderate summers, allow for enough ice accumulation to account for an ice age?
Yeah, well, first of all, you need to realize that we don't think the winters were as cold as they are now. We think as a result of the Ice Age, you actually had cooler summers and mild winters. So it's not a question of the temperatures being really severe, it's a question of the precipitation. And we think that as a result, most of this precipitation is going to be from storms. And you're going to get a lot more precipitation than what we do today. And that is a big key to explaining how you can get the ice sheets to form during and after the Ice Age. So yes, there's going to be much more precipitation during the Ice Age, but it's not because the winters are extremely cold. In fact, by the way, that is one of the problems with secular explanations for an Ice Age. You see, most people think, oh, well, you just need colder temperatures to get an Ice Age. The problem with that is that colder air has less moisture. So it's paradoxical. If the temperatures get too cold, you actually get less snowfall. And that's one of the reasons they have such a hard time explaining an Ice Age within their uniformitarian worldview.
Good. Well, let's do one more.
Okay.
How did all ocean life survive if the oceans increase temperature rapidly?
Right.
Like corals, mammals, fish, and plankton.
Right. Well, this is something that Mike Ord has looked at. This is why he would argue that he thinks the average ocean temperature after the flood was 86 degrees. And that's just a rough number. Larry Vardaman thinks it might have been higher than that. But the reason for that is, yes, life did survive. So it would have to be warm, but it can't be too warm. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, though, that everything in the ocean survived. I mean, there's a lot of aquatic creatures that perished in the flood, and probably a lot that actually became extinct during the flood. So, not all of them are going to survive, but we know, the temperature had to not be so high that life could not survive after the flood. So that's a constraint that we have to put on our models.
So I do have one more question for you.
Okay.
Tonight proved to me that this topic is very complicated. And I do not feel like the information is accessible to me. Even a slight understanding to have a dialogue with someone.
Yeah.
And I imagine there's a lot of people here tonight that are feeling the same way.
Get the booklet.
Yeah. Take
the booklet home.
That was going to be my first of two questions. Is you showed us several resources. Of the ones that you have, which would be the best one to go for if we were wanting to dive into this deeper?
We've got a lot. If you're talking specifically about the Ice Age, I think the little booklet is probably, it's got the most detail. Our Creation Answers book, the Creation Basics and Beyond, also deals with that, but not as much detail because it's also dealing with other topics. But I think right now, we're hoping we'll change this. Of course, we've got our Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis series as well, but again, that's a 22-minute episode. You can only cover so much. But I think we managed to cram a lot of information into that little booklet. And I think the Acts and Facts articles, I think, have some good stuff as well, too.
And does that booklet make climate change accessible for us? Can we understand climate change through that?
Okay, are you asking about global warming?
Yes.
Okay, we didn't really address that. Okay. I think creation scientists have taken a very responsible position on that issue. Mike Ord and Larry Vardaman have said, hey, maybe there could very well be global warming, and some of it might even be man-made. But apparently there has not been any in the last 18 years, and I do think there is a lot of politics going into that issue, and I don't think a lot of the people who are pushing the draconian extreme measures, I think they've got an agenda. And so one thing I can say for sure is that you should not be panicking over this issue. And you have to realize there is a subtle connection between old earth beliefs and extremism on that issue. And there's actually a subtle connection to the astronomical theory. Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming out tonight.
All right.
It's really been good to have you here and share with us this wonderful information.
I was delighted to do it. Okay. All right.